So Jacob and Laban settle their dispute, and essentially they create this border. Laban says, you can't come back across this border. Don't come back towards my house or we're going to have problems. And so Jacob continues to head west towards his homeland. This is where Esau, his older brother, lives. He hasn't seen Esau since he cheated him out of everything. Doesn't know what's going on or how Esau is going to receive him. So Jacob sends him some messengers and some gifts to Esau, hoping to kind of smooth things out. The messengers go see Esau. They come back, chapter 32, verse 6. They say to Jacob, we met your brother Esau, and he's already on his way to meet you. He somehow found out you're coming, and he's coming to meet you with an army of 400 men. That's not good. And so Jacob, it says, was terrified at the news. So you understand this situation he's in. This is why context is so important. You've got Laban behind him. And what does Jacob say to Laban? I'm scared, so I ran away. Esau's in front of him, coming at him, 400 men. And he says, I'm terrified. He's coming to get me. So he's got to do what he does. He's got to try to manipulate the situation, kind of look out for himself. So he separates his wives, his children, possessions, livestock into two different groups. He's diversifying, minimizing his losses. He's going to send them out in two different groups. He's going to see which one Esau attacks first. That'll give the other group time to escape, and he'll join with whatever group that is. So he sends out these two groups, and he stays by himself back in the camp. See what's going to happen. And it is there that he wrestles with God. And we read about that story, verse 24. He wrestles with a man who's later revealed to be an angel of the Lord. It says, this left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip. So when he saw that Jacob wasn't going to let him go, that he wasn't going to overcome Jacob, that Jacob wasn't going to run away, he touched Jacob's hip and he wrenched it out of socket. And then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. And Jacob said, I won't let you go until you bless me. I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to quit at this. I'm staying here. I'm going to struggle through it. I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. The man asked, what is your name? He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be called Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men, and you have won. Verse 29, please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. And then he blessed Jacob there. And so Jacob wrestles with God. You know, most commentators, when you see the angel of the Lord referred to in the Old Testament, this is oftentimes a reference to Jesus making an appearance in the Old Testament. And so Jacob at first doesn't realize it, and this man comes up, tackles him. I don't know, a lot could go into explaining that, but he wrestles with this man that turns out to be God, angel of the Lord, and he comes out blessed. So here's a few things to look at, is that he wrestles with God when he is desperate and alone. He's got some business to do with God. He's had some business to do with God. It's long overdue. But he's been running from God for a long time, but now there's nowhere left to run. Verse 24 says he was all alone, and my guess is that Jacob didn't do all alone very well or very often. We already know about him as you read through his narrative that he was a workaholic. He grew up wanting desperately the blessing of his father. He didn't get it and went to his older brother. So he's going to spend his life trying to earn that blessing. He's going to spend his life trying to prove his father wrong. A lot of men handle their desperation in this way. They just think, if I work a little bit harder, if I become a little bit more successful, if I can just find my identity in this over here, then I'll have value, then I'll have worth. And he worked a lot. And he had 2 wives, a bunch of children, all kinds of servants. In other words, his life was surrounded by noise, never by himself, never without a task list, always something to do, always someone that needed something from him. And in a world, as I was reading this week, where we, on average, check our phones, you want to guess how many times a day? Check our phones on average 221 times a day. Just check it. 221 times a day we look at our phones. All alone is not something that most of us do very well. We surround ourselves with noise. We surround ourselves with distractions, with busyness. And if you just be quiet long enough, if you just sit still long enough, you might find that Jesus will tackle you. It's time to do some business with God. If you just clear your head long enough, you stop looking at your watch long enough, stop thinking about what's for lunch long enough, stop trying to focus on the game long enough, you quit downloading apps long enough, you might find that he has some business to do with you. And for Jacob, I think this was probably the first time in a long time he's just all alone. He's by himself. He's some things with God that need to be addressed. And until those things are addressed, it's going to be difficult for him to receive that blessing. I think this is true for a lot of us. We ask for God's blessing in a certain area of our life, but the truth is there are things with him that need to be addressed. We don't want to address them because it's painful or it's hurt. It's a struggle. It's a wrestling match, right? And so we ask for God's blessing. We want God's blessing, but there's some business that needs to be taken care of, some things that need to be addressed. Yesterday morning, my wife signed our family up for a 5K mud run. And it wasn't my idea. I wasn't especially excited about it, mostly because I knew she'd beat me, and she did. But she signed us up for that, and we had like 30 people come with us, and we had a lot of fun, made some good memories, but it almost went horribly wrong. Because in the morning, we go to register for this, to sign waivers and such, and I was doing that at the table. So there's 3 volunteers, workers for this mud run. On the other side of the table, I'm filling out paperwork, promising I won't sue if I die and such. And I'm talking with them about the course, and then someone comes up to me and starts talking. And I assume it's one of my younger daughters, and so I say, while I'm working, I'm like, don't interrupt. I'll finish back talking to the people. And I could see that there was some tension, I could just feel it coming from this direction. And I look over, and it's not one of my daughters, it's my wife. Right? Here's what I did. My wife's right here talking to me about something, and I'm like, don't interrupt. No. You don't do that. Especially when there's a mud obstacle course where a lot of accidents can happen, right? And so I can feel the tension. I look over, I realize, oh, you're my wife. This is my wife. I thought it was one of my younger daughters. This is my wife. And so I'm trying to explain the situation and she's just standing there with her eyes, eyebrows raised. And here's what I know. I didn't have to do that, but 20 years of marriage tells you, you need to get this right quickly. Like you take responsibility, you explain what happened. That's what I did. I said, I thought she was one of my daughters. This is my wife. I'd never do that. I'm sorry, honey. But I could have doubled down. I could have been like, what? I said, don't interrupt. I could have done that. Would that have gone well? No, it would. I could have pretended like it didn't happen. We could have gone on with our day. And slowly, there would have been more tension, there would have been more division, would have been more problems. And if I just would have dealt with something early on, or I did, thankfully, but if I wouldn't have dealt with something early on, it would have gotten much worse. See, I think we recognize the need to do some business with people sometimes that we share life with. We know that certain things you don't just pretend like they didn't happen. Sometimes we miss this, though, in our relationship with God, and days go by, and weeks go by, and months go by, and years go by, and we start to feel distant. We don't understand why. We've prayed for God's blessing, but he seems like he doesn't care. And look, you got some business to do with him. Just get by yourself long enough to address some of these things. I think this is huge for Jacob. He finds himself alone in the camp, and Jesus shows up. Secondly, we find out that he does this, he wrestles with God when there's nowhere to run. Desperation usually sets in when we run out of options. Those options have been exhausted. The common denominator for many people who turn to God is, frankly, that they have nowhere else to turn. I hear that often in church. I've experienced that in plenty of areas of my life. I might have prayed for God, I might have asked God for his help, but I didn't really cry out to him until I just didn't know what else to do. I couldn't fix it, I tried. I couldn't manipulate it, I tried. I had tried to put a Band-Aid over it, I tried to, It wasn't working. A while back, I was in the car. I was listening to a radio interview done with a guy named Gerald Sitzer, who was a professor at Whitworth College in Spokane at the time. A number of years ago, Gerald was in a car accident, and some members of his family were in the minivan. They were hit by a drunk driver, and Gerald lost 3 generations of women in his life. His mom, his wife, his young daughter, they all died in that accident. He walked away without a scratch. He just talks about in his book trying to learning to live with that. I love the title of the book. It's just called A Grace Disguised. It's a gift of desperation, that there was grace, but boy, it sure didn't come the way he thought it should or would. And I love this observation that he makes. This is really good. He says, look, the quickest way for anyone to reach the sun and the light of day is not to run west, chasing after the setting sun, but to head east, plunging into the darkness until one comes to the sunrise. Right? Like instinctively, intuitively, we see darkness setting, we see darkness coming, and we run away from it. Head west, get away from the darkness. And we run and we run and we run, trying to outrun some consequences, trying to outrun some relationships. We just run away. But what if the fastest way to the sun is to plunge into the darkness, head east? And that's essentially what we read here. Couldn't run anymore. And he doesn't run from the angel of the Lord this time. Doesn't flee. He fights through the darkness. And he doesn't give up fighting until he gets to the blessing. 2 things come out of this wrestling match with God. Number 1, he's blessed. Something interesting as you just read the life of Jacob is he would pray, but when he would pray prior to this, he would always pray to the God of his father Abraham and his father Isaac. It seemed that his experience with God was more based on his heritage. It was passed down to him, but it was really more theirs than his. But in this desperate moment, he experiences God, he encounters God, he meets Jesus personally. His name gets changed in verse 27. Verse 28 says, you will no longer be called Jacob, but you'll be called Israel. And then he's blessed, and he receives this blessing. So Jacob's perspective, right? His whole life, he's wanted the blessing. From the time he was born, it wasn't his, it was his brother's. And he tried to cheat it, tried to passive-aggressive his way into it. But he didn't get the blessing from his father. He really wanted it from his father. Never came. He wanted the blessing from Laban, his uncle. Didn't happen. He tried to work hard. He tried to prove himself, but it didn't come. And finally, he gets the blessing from God. So the question is, what did he do different, right? What did he do different to receive this blessing? Well, he stopped running, and he fought for it. Really, all he did, though, in this wrestling match, all he did was desperately hang on to God and refuse to let go. That's really what he did. That's kind of the only move he had. I'm just going to hang on and not let go. It's not a bad move if you're wrestling with God. You just hang on and don't let go. Maybe some of you saw the article last week in the front page of the Outlook about Annie Yoho. Annie and her husband David usually sit right down front on Sunday mornings. And the story told about Annie being treated for breast cancer that had metastasized to her lymph nodes. And she went from being a personal trainer in great shape, taking great care of herself, to radiation treatments 5 days a week for 6 weeks. And I just loved the article because in the article she wasn't prescriptive, like, well, this is what you do and this is... No, she said, I leaned heavily on God. Hung on to him, didn't let go. And here's what she says, quote, God took my physical brokenness and he turned it into something wonderful. And he made me different than I was before the cancer. And she talks about some of the gifts that God gave her in her desperation. He gave her the gift of joy, a deeper joy that she had known before the cancer. And he gave her the gift of mercy, for other people, much more profound than she had experienced before the cancer. And she felt free from a lot of her fears that she had struggled with before the cancer. And she found a new purpose and ministry for life that she didn't have before the cancer, and all these gifts that came in the desperation. And I would just say to you, look, God doesn't want you to be the same as you were before the addiction, or before the abuse, or before the affair, or before the breakup, or before the financial devastation, or before the diagnosis, or before the divorce. He doesn't want you to be the same as you were before the death of your loved one. He wants you to lean heavily on him, and as you do, he's got some gifts for you. They're going to surprise you. You refuse to let go. You fight for it. You'll be blessed. Other thing that happens is that he walks with a limp. Verse 25, it's kind of a telling verse. You're like, well, how is he holding his own if this is supposed to be an angel of the Lord? Well, get a glimpse into maybe the kind of effort the angel of the Lord was putting into this wrestling match. It just says in verse 25 that the angel of the Lord touched his hip. The word touch is a word that means lightly taps. It's the idea, right? Like you're coming up behind somebody, you don't want to startle them, and so it's just a gentle tap. That's what this is. Touches, just barely taps Jacob's hip, and it wrenches out of socket. Incredible pain would leave him with a limp for the rest of his life. This is an odd thing about wrestling with God. You will come out of it with a limp and a blessing. Some of you understand that. For some of you, this makes no sense. Some of you, complete sense. Jacob wrestles with God, and he comes out of it both blessed and broken. He's got a limp he's going to live with for the rest of his life, but that limp is a reminder of a blessing. He's got scars, but those scars tell a story of a struggle and of a blessing. The struggle was difficult. Leaves him limping. It was painful. It hurt. Not sure he could go another round if he had to, but there was a blessing. Some of you walk in here that way. I know that. You come in here limping. Some of you come in here with scars. And you try to cover them up, and you don't want other people to know about kind of the struggle you've been having with God, or kind of the wrestling match you've been in with God, or some of the things that you're going through. And so you do your best to cover up the limp, or you do your best to hide the scars. You don't need to do that here. You don't need to do that here. This is a place where it's okay. It's okay to limp. In some ways, it tells me more about you when you limp than when you don't. I imagine Jacob had a pretty good story to go with this. You ever have a friend who has some injury, and you've heard the story 100 times, but somebody that you don't know, says, well, what happened? What happened to your knee? Looks like you've got a bad knee. And suddenly you're having to listen to the story about a high school championship football game. And they've got the story that goes with their limp, and they've got stories that go with their scars. And Jacob got a story out of this to tell. I bet he shared it often. I imagine this is how it went down. He came back, and some people notice he's limping. Jacob, what happened? You're limping. What happened, Jacob? Well, first of all, it's not Jacob, it's Israel. Secondly, there was this wrestling match with God that took place. My guess is that people love to hear that story. There's something pretty compelling about someone who tells a story about the time they wrestled with God. For some of you, that needs to be a story you tell. You have been running. You have been manipulating. You have been passive aggressive, trying to control situations and people. And it's all kind of catching up with you. And you can keep running. You can put God off. You can leave here and decide you're not going to come back, or you can do some business. I'm not saying it won't be painful. It will. I'm not saying you won't have a limp. You will. But you'll also receive a gift. He will bless you. Let's pray. God, I would ask you to help us recognize the desperation of the situation. That you would teach us, God, to cry out to you because we need help. God, if not now, I know that for a lot of folks in this room, there'll be a time. It's coming. As much as I'd love to be able to knock on their door and beg them now, I know that there's some, and they're really ready to get out of here and get to lunch, and they've just got other things. But would you plant this in them? God, would you allow it so that they could just maybe remember some of these things? And they would know that the right response is to cry out to you in humility. God, I thank you for Jesus who allows us to come to you in our time of need. Now we come to you in our weakness, and you will give us strength. So would you help us to do that as a church family in these next few moments? It's in Jesus' name, amen. The Bible tells us that we can approach the throne of grace with confidence. We can approach God's throne of grace with confidence that he will help us in our time of need because of Jesus. We don't have to be afraid. We can come to him. We can ask for help. If you want to do that, if you want to talk to someone about your relationship with Jesus, putting your trust in Christ, if you're ready to cry out to him for salvation, this is the right place. This is the right time. You can meet me down front over here, or you can go back to the room that's on your left, first floor. Or maybe you're ready to become a part of this church family. We'd love to have you as part of this church family. We're going to be on this path together. We'll be limping our way, but we'll be on the path together, and we'd love to have you. Let's stand together, let's worship, and let's cry out to our great God.